Warhammer 40k Darktide is constantly evolving, and after several years worth of updates, I would say that the game feels so drastically different from where it was when it was released that it almost feels like a sequel or a 2.0 version of the game, if you will. For the past couple years, Fatshark has been playing catch up with Darktide because it released in a pretty poor state, but I kind of get the feeling that they're putting themselves into this perpetual cycle where they're always going to be playing catch up. Especially with the balance of this game, because it seems like the next few updates are going to be really pivotal in that they're probably going to be introducing more enemies, more enemy types, and more mutators for Havoc, basically things that make the game more dynamic and much more challenging. I know that the community is ready for something like veteran tier weapons to be added to the game, but I don't think the community is ready for Havoc's 41 through 50. I think at the end of the day, what the community really wants is something much more simple. Better optimization so that their friends don't crash every other game, better cosmetics and more access to said cosmetics, and a much more streamlined experience. So you could understand where I'm coming from, let's talk about where the game was at when it was released, and let's talk about all the major updates that it's had so far. When the game first launched, the best thing about it was its gameplay and its combat. The shooting has always felt really snappy, the movement has always felt really smooth, and the melee is pretty much the best first-person combat melee system in the industry. Realistically, probably only second to Vermintide 2. But the game only had 4 really basic classes, the Ogryn, Veteran, Zealot, and the Psyker, and each class only had 1 ability and 1 blitz, and they utilized a Vermintide 2 class talent tree design because Fatshark originally planned on releasing all the other abilities and blitzes that we currently have as different classes. Additionally, the itemization that was in the game was horrendous. It seems like Fatshark was trying to make a looter shooter, but they didn't have any of the tools or systems in place that make a looter shooter fun. The only thing available at the time was the mission board, which was fine because it funneled all the players in the community into one playlist, and during year 1, there really wasn't much of a community. But the worst thing about Darktide on launch was the optimization. Somehow, it was worse then than it is now, and it is really bad now. Fatshark still really needs to do something about the optimization in this game. And I'm talking both server side and client side. But with all that being said, it didn't take very long for Fatshark to realize that they couldn't just release a terrible product without fixing anything. Plus, Darktide had a lot of Vermintide 2 veterans, and they went from a game that was a complete package with a lot of supporting systems to a game that basically had none of those supporting systems. And thus began Fatshark's journey to play catch-up and try to bring the game up to the same standard as Vermintide 2. The first major update that was released for Darktide was the first itemization rework, and at the time it seemed like Fatshark was holding on to the idea that loot was going to be really important in Darktide as a way to get players to play the game more, grind more, and keep coming back for more. And obviously, that really didn't work out. The original penances were released during this time too, and they were something. The next major update added endgame content to Darktide in the form of Oryx, Maelstroms, and by proxy, Auric Maelstroms. The biggest problems with Oryx and Auric Maelstroms at the time were that they were more difficult than the standard mission board, but they weren't really giving you better rewards. So the game was in this situation where the developers wanted loot to be more exciting, but they didn't really want to do anything to make loot more exciting. Additionally, Oryx made the game significantly harder, and I think this is the major reason why the developers released the first major class overhaul shortly after they dropped the endgame content. The original class overhaul introduced talent trees to each of the classes, introduced more abilities, more blitzes, and made a lot of different weapons more viable to play in Oryx and Auric Maelstroms. In the following year, it was very clear that Darktide started to move away from loot as the primary means of getting the player engaged with the game and more towards fun and challenge. The first step was to introduce penances, which gave players different ways to play the game, or more specifically, rewarded you for playing the game differently. Penances gave players a reason to experiment with different builds by rewarding the player with cosmetic items. And right after penances, we got hit with the second itemization rework. This new take on itemization basically converted the itemization system into another progression system. Instead of trying to grind for good items, the good items are inherently available to the player after a certain amount of time. Shortly after this, Darktide was updated with its next endgame system, Havoc. In Havoc, the game would throw more enemies at you, you would have less HP, less toughness, less ammo, and for a lot of people, less fun. The introduction of different mutators to the game that forced you to play differently and build differently is a really good idea and a great concept. But Havoc was plagued and is still plagued by the simple fact that it doesn't have any matchmaking. Additionally, the game was just made harder, which means that on the balance side of things would need to change again. Do you see where I'm going with this yet? Do you have deja vu? Shortly after Havoc was released, Mortis Trials arrived to Darktide, and this was Fat Shark's take on a horde game mode with roguelike elements. Mortis Trials is the complete opposite of Havoc, in that in Havoc, the further that you progress in Havoc and the higher that you climb in Havoc, the weaker the player character gets. In Mortis Trials, the player character actually gets stronger as you progress in any given Mortis Trial. At the same time, Havoc was also updated, and it introduced new mutators, lieutenants, and weakened monsters to the game mode. This has made Havoc an extremely replayable and dynamic and fun experience, but it also made Havoc much more difficult. And you know what that means. The next few updates introduced power creep that we've already seen before. The Ogryn got reworked, the Arbites class was added to the game, and now we've had every other class that was in the game reworked as well, the Veteran, the Zealot, and the Psyker. At this point, Darktide has had 2 itemization reworks, 2 variants of endgame added to the game, and 2 different class reworks. It's kind of a meme, but Darktide seems to be stuck in this perpetual cycle where content keeps getting added to the game, which is apparently necessitating buffs for the player, which creates power creep, which means that more content needs to get added to the game to address that power creep, and so on and so forth. The cycle just never ends. And this is where we arrive to the current state of the game, where most weapons and playstyles and builds are viable for the core game, like the Mission Board, Oryx, Arc Maelstroms, and Mortis Trials, but the moment that you step into the higher Havoc difficulties, you're forced to use very specific setups if you want to be successful and if you're the average player. Obviously, if you're cracked, you could use whatever you want. Right now, when it comes to the game's actual gameplay, every class feels really good to play, but how long is that going to last? Additionally, the game has a ton of content. I estimate that it takes probably 200 hours or so to get all classes to max level and to get every weapon mastery maxed out, and then start diving into Havoc and everything. But with that being said, I think that the developers are starting to see that Havoc isn't necessarily the end-all be-all for Darktide. At a certain point, the developers are going to have to draw a line somewhere and address game balance at a fundamental level. And this is important because the future of Darktide is obviously going to introduce more maps and more weapons, but it's probably also going to introduce significantly more enemies. This can be in the form of more cultists, heretic guard, chaos demons, or maybe even gene stealers, but whatever form that it takes, it's gonna make endgame content significantly more difficult because it's going to be significantly more dynamic. But even after balancing the game, the players still need more content to engage with. I still think that penances were one of the most, if not the most, pivotal update that this game has ever received because it gave players more reasons to play the game. Cosmetics and having a character that looks cool motivate people to play the game. Funny enough, I think that a simple blueprint for securing the success of Darktide's future would be to perform a complete Commodore's Vestures rework, basically remove all the FOMO BS that exists in the store right now, add a third-person hotkey so that people can inspect their character while they're in-game, and then rework Havoc in a way where you're able to earn Aquillas in Havoc on a weekly, monthly, or quarterly basis. Basically, whenever you rotate mutators. My idea would be that Havoc would be completely reworked from the bottom up. You would remove levels 1 through 40, replace them with the game's base difficulties, so basically having Auric in Havoc, and then make it so that on a weekly basis, the mutators rotate, and if you complete the Auric Havoc every week, then you earn Aquillas. I know that I'm ranting and going off subject a little bit, but I really believe that creating an end-game cosmetic grind would secure the loyalty and goodwill of players forever. Plus, making Havoc simpler would make it much easier to add matchmaking to the game mode. Regardless, after 2 class reworks, after 2 itemization reworks, and after 2 cracks at endgame content, I think that the game is basically Darktide 2.0 now. I'm still having a lot of fun with Darktide, especially since now there's significantly more build variety in Oryx and Arc Maelstrom. But let me know how you guys feel about the current state of the game, or let me know what you think about where the game is going in the future. As always, I appreciate your viewership. This has been Jefficus, and I'll see you in-game.